Sarah Martinez never thought her life would end up like this. Running through the dark woods with torn clothes and bleeding feet, she could hear the sheriff's dogs barking in the distance. The sound made her heart race faster than it already was. 3 months ago, she had been a normal woman living in Pine Creek, working at the local diner and taking care of her sick mother. Now she was a fugitive with a price on her head. The trouble started when she witnessed something she shouldn't have. Sarah had been closing up the diner late one night when she saw Sheriff Duncan loading wooden boxes into the back of his official car. Nothing seemed strange about it until she noticed the boxes had strange markings on them. The same markings she had seen on packages that came through town before people started getting sick with that new drug problem. Sarah knew she should have walked away and minded her own business. But when she saw Sheriff Duncan meeting with Marcus Reeves, the town's biggest criminal, she couldn't ignore it anymore. She took photos with her phone from behind the dumpster. The flash went off by accident. Both men looked straight at her hiding spot. That was the beginning of her nightmare. The next morning, Sheriff Duncan showed up at her door with a warrant for her arrest. He claimed she had been selling drugs to teenagers in town. Sarah knew it was a lie, but who would believe her word against the sheriff's? The evidence he showed looked real enough to fool anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Sarah's mother begged her to stay and fight the charges in court. But Sarah knew better. She had seen what happened to other people who crossed Sheriff Duncan. They either disappeared or ended up dead in suspicious accidents. The sheriff owned half the town and had judges in his pocket. Fighting him legally would be like fighting a fire with gasoline. So Sarah ran. She packed a small bag in the middle of the night and left through her bedroom window. Her mother was sleeping and Sarah couldn't bear to wake her up and say goodbye. She left a note saying she would come back when it was safe, but she wasn't sure if that day would ever come. The first week of running was the hardest. Sarah had never lived rough before. She slept in abandoned buildings and ate food from garbage cans behind restaurants. The sheriff put out a bulletin saying she was armed and dangerous. He offered a reward of $50,000 for her capture, dead or alive. That bounty made Sarah more valuable than most bank robbers. Every day brought new close calls. Sheriff Duncan had deputies searching every town within 100 miles. He also hired bounty hunters to track her down. Sarah learned to move only at night and hide during the day. She dyed her brown hair black and cut it short. She bought men's clothes from thrift stores to disguise her shape. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold nights sleeping rough. It was knowing that her mother was alone and sick, while Sarah couldn't even call to check on her. Sarah tried to phone home once from a payphone, but someone else answered. A man's voice said her mother had been moved to a care facility because she couldn't take care of herself anymore. Sarah knew this was Sheriff Duncan's doing. After 2 months of running, Sarah thought she had finally found a safe place. She was staying in an old cabin deep in the mountains, far from any roads. A kind old man named Joe had found her half-starved and offered her the cabin in exchange for helping him with his small farm. For 3 weeks, Sarah felt almost normal again. She helped Joe feed his chickens and tend his vegetable garden. He never asked questions about why she was hiding, but Sheriff Duncan's reach was longer than Sarah had imagined. One morning, she woke up to the sound of trucks coming up the mountain road. Joe was gone, and there was an envelope on the kitchen table with Sarah's name on it. Inside was a note saying he was sorry, but he needed the money more than he needed his conscience. The $50,000 bounty was too much for an old man to ignore. Sarah grabbed her backpack and ran out the back door just as Sheriff Duncan's men surrounded the front of the cabin. She could hear them shouting orders and dogs barking. The sheriff himself was there directing the search with a cold smile on his face. He was enjoying this hunt like it was some kind of game. The chase through the forest was brutal. Sarah's feet were cut up from running without proper shoes. Branches tore at her clothes and face. The dogs were getting closer and she could hear men shouting behind her. Sheriff Duncan was using a megaphone, telling her that she might as well give up because there was nowhere left to run. Sarah reached the edge of a cliff and looked down at the river far below. The drop had to be at least 60 feet and the water looked cold and dangerous. But the sound of barking dogs was getting louder. She could hear Sheriff Duncan's voice getting closer, promising that he would make her death quick if she surrendered now. Standing on that cliff edge, Sarah realized that her old life was truly over. The woman who had worked at the diner and taken care of her mother was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who had learned to survive against impossible odds. Sheriff Duncan had created exactly the kind of enemy he should have feared most, someone with nothing left to lose. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped back from the edge. She wasn't ready to die yet, not when Sheriff Duncan was still free to hurt other people the way he had hurt her. She needed to find another way down from this mountain, and she needed help from someone who wasn't afraid of the sheriff's money or power. That was when she heard something that made her freeze in place. It wasn't the sound of dogs or deputies shouting. It was the sound of a single person moving quietly through the trees, trying not to be heard. Someone was tracking her who wasn't part of Sheriff Duncan's group. Someone who moved like a professional hunter. The bounty hunter who had been tracking Sarah through the forest was nothing like she expected. When he finally stepped out from behind the trees, she saw a tall man with weathered hands and tired eyes. He wasn't wearing a uniform or carrying the kind of heavy weapons that Sheriff Duncan's men used. Instead, he had a simple hunting rifle and clothes that had seen many days in the wilderness. His name was Jake Morrison, and he had been hunting fugitives for 15 years. But something about this case felt different from the beginning. The sheriff's story about Sarah being a dangerous drug dealer didn't match the evidence Jake had found while tracking her. Drug dealers didn't help old farmers with their chickens. They didn't leave money on the counter of small stores when they took food. They didn't carefully avoid hurting anyone during their escape. Jake had found all these signs during his 3-day hunt for Sarah. At the cabin where Joe lived, he discovered that Sarah had been doing repairs on the old man's roof and had planted a new garden behind the house. When Jake questioned Joe about Sarah's behavior, the old man broke down crying. He said Sarah was the kindest person he had met in years, and he felt terrible about turning her in for the money. The bounty hunter also investigated Sarah's background more carefully than Sheriff Duncan probably expected. He visited the diner where she used to work and talked to her former co-workers. Everyone said the same thing. Sarah was honest, hardworking, and devoted to her sick mother. She never caused trouble and never had anything to do with drugs or criminals. Jake even managed to visit Sarah's mother at the care facility where Sheriff Duncan had placed her. The old woman was confused and scared, asking constantly when her daughter would come home. She told Jake that Sarah had always been a good girl who never broke the law. The mother also mentioned that Sarah had been acting nervous in the weeks before she disappeared, saying something about seeing things she shouldn't have seen. All of this information made Jake suspicious about the real reason Sarah was running. In his experience, innocent people didn't usually have $50,000 bounties placed on their heads by small-town sheriffs. That kind of money suggested that Sarah knew something important enough to make powerful people very nervous. When Jake finally caught up to Sarah on the mountain cliff, he made a decision that surprised both of them. Instead of arresting her immediately, he offered her a deal. He would help her get down from the mountain safely, and in exchange she would tell him the truth about why Sheriff Duncan wanted her captured so badly. Sarah was suspicious at first. She had learned not to trust anyone who might be working with the sheriff, but Jake's calm manner and the fact that he hadn't just shot her or called for backup made her think he might be different. She was also exhausted from running and knew she couldn't survive much longer on her own. They found a narrow path down the backside of the cliff that the sheriff's men hadn't discovered yet. Jake led the way, showing Sarah how to move quietly and avoid leaving tracks that could be followed. He shared his food and water with her, and gave her a warmer jacket to replace her torn shirt. During their careful descent, Sarah told Jake everything. She explained about witnessing Sheriff Duncan loading the mysterious boxes into his car and meeting with Marcus Reeves. She showed him the photos she had taken with her phone, though they were blurry and hard to make out clearly. She also told him about how quickly the sheriff had produced evidence against her, and how he seemed to have unlimited resources for tracking her down. Jake listened to everything without interrupting. When Sarah finished her story, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he told her that her story matched things he had been hearing from other bounty hunters and law enforcement officers in the region. There were rumors about Sheriff Duncan being involved in drug trafficking, but no one had been able to prove anything because he was too careful and too well connected. The bounty hunter explained that he had taken this job because he needed the money for his own family problems. His wife was sick and needed expensive medical treatment that their insurance wouldn't cover. The $50,000 reward would pay for her surgery and give them a chance at a normal life again. But now that he had heard Sarah's story and seen the evidence of her character, he couldn't bring himself to turn her in to a corrupt sheriff. Instead, Jake proposed something that surprised Sarah even more. He suggested that they work together to gather real evidence against Sheriff Duncan. Jake had contacts in state law enforcement and the federal government who would be interested in taking down a corrupt sheriff involved in drug trafficking, but they would need more than blurry photos and witness testimony to build a solid case. Sarah was scared of this plan. She had been running and hiding for months, and the idea of actively fighting back against Sheriff Duncan seemed incredibly dangerous. But she was also tired of living like a hunted animal, and she knew that her mother's health was getting worse every day she stayed away. Jake explained that they would need to be very careful and very smart. Sheriff Duncan had most of the local law enforcement under his control, but he couldn't control everyone. There were still honest cops and federal agents who would act on solid evidence of corruption. The key was gathering that evidence without getting themselves killed in the process. They spent that night in an abandoned ranger station that Jake knew about. While Sarah slept, Jake used his radio to contact some of his law enforcement friends. He told them that he was working on a case that might involve police corruption and asked for advice about how to proceed safely. The responses he got confirmed that Sarah's situation was being taken seriously by people outside of Sheriff Duncan's influence. The next morning, Jake showed Sarah a newspaper article that made her blood run cold. Her mother had died 3 days ago at the care facility. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the timing seemed very suspicious. Sarah realized that Sheriff Duncan had been using her mother as bait, hoping that Sarah would try to come home for the funeral. Sarah cried for the first time since she had started running. All of her efforts to stay alive and stay free felt pointless now that the person she was protecting was gone. Jake tried to comfort her, but he could see that something fundamental had changed in Sarah's attitude. The grief was turning into anger, and the anger was turning into determination to make Sheriff Duncan pay for what he had done. That afternoon, they saw smoke rising from the valley below. Jake used his binoculars to look down at the source of the fire. It was the old cabin where Sarah had been staying with Joe. Sheriff Duncan's men had burned it down, probably out of frustration at losing their target. Jake could see the sheriff's car parked nearby, and several deputies searching through the ashes. Sarah watched the smoke rising and made a promise to herself. She was done running and hiding. It was time to take the fight back to Sheriff Duncan, even if it meant risking everything. Jake saw the change in her expression and knew that the quiet diner waitress was gone forever. In her place was someone who had been shaped by loss and betrayal into something much more dangerous. Jake Morrison had been planning to help Sarah gather evidence against Sheriff Duncan, but he never expected her to become so focused on revenge. After seeing her mother's death notice and watching her childhood home get searched by deputies, Sarah had changed into someone harder and more dangerous. She spent hours studying maps of Pine Creek, memorizing patrol schedules, and asking Jake detailed questions about surveillance and weapons. The bounty hunter was starting to worry that he had created a bigger problem than the one he was trying to solve. Sarah's plan was too risky and too personal. She wanted to break into Sheriff Duncan's office at night and steal the evidence that would prove his involvement in drug trafficking. Jake tried to explain that this kind of direct action would probably get them both killed, but Sarah wasn't interested in being careful anymore. Their partnership became tense during the week they spent hiding in an old mining camp in the mountains. Jake wanted to contact his federal law enforcement friends and let them handle the investigation properly. Sarah insisted that the federal agents would take too long and probably wouldn't believe their story without concrete evidence. She pointed out that Sheriff Duncan had been operating his criminal network for years while other law enforcement agencies looked the other way. The argument came to a head when Sarah announced that she was going to Pine Creek, with or without Jake's help. She had stolen a gun from one of the abandoned cabins they had searched, and she was prepared to use it if necessary. Jake realized that trying to stop her would be like trying to stop a forest fire with his bare hands. Sarah had been pushed beyond the point where she cared about her own safety. So Jake made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He agreed to help Sarah with her plan, but he secretly contacted Sheriff Duncan and offered to deliver her in exchange for the full bounty. Jake told himself that this was the only way to keep Sarah from getting herself killed. He planned to turn her over to the sheriff and then work with his federal contacts to investigate Duncan's operation from the outside. What Jake didn't realize was that Sheriff Duncan had been monitoring law enforcement, communications and knew about the bounty hunter's contacts with federal agents. Duncan was smart enough to understand that Jake Morrison posed a threat to his entire operation. The sheriff decided that both Sarah and Jake needed to disappear permanently, but he wanted to use Jake's betrayal to capture Sarah first. The plan Jake worked out with Sheriff Duncan seemed simple. Jake would bring Sarah to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Pine Creek late at night. Duncan would be waiting there with just a few trusted deputies, and the arrest would happen quietly without any witnesses. Jake insisted that Sarah should be taken alive and given a fair trial, and Sheriff Duncan agreed to these terms. Sarah suspected nothing when Jake suggested they scout the warehouse as a potential base of operations for gathering evidence against the sheriff. She trusted Jake completely by this point, believing that he was the only person who truly understood what she had been through. The bounty hunter's guilty conscience made him extra helpful and protective during their final days together, which only convinced Sarah that he was completely on her side. On the night of the planned betrayal, Jake led Sarah through the dark streets of Pine Creek toward the warehouse. He had given her a detailed story about why this location would be perfect for breaking into Sheriff Duncan's office. Sarah was excited and nervous, but she trusted Jake's experience and judgment. She had no idea that she was walking into a trap that would end with her death. Sheriff Duncan was waiting inside the warehouse with 6 heavily armed deputies, but the sheriff had his own secret plan that Jake knew nothing about. Duncan intended to kill both Sarah and Jake, then claim that they had been working together as partners in the drug operation. This story would explain why a bounty hunter had spent so much time tracking Sarah instead of simply capturing her immediately. The warehouse had been set up to look like a drug laboratory. Sheriff Duncan's men had planted evidence that would support the story about Sarah and Jake being criminal partners. There were bags of fake drugs, money-counting machines, and weapons that could be linked to other unsolved crimes in the area. Duncan planned to stage a shootout that would leave both of his problems dead and give him a heroic story about breaking up a major drug operation. When Jake and Sarah entered the warehouse, everything seemed normal at first. Jake was looking for an excuse to signal Sheriff Duncan's men without alerting Sarah to what was happening. But before he could act, Sarah spotted something that made her freeze in place. She recognized one of the wooden boxes sitting on a table near the back wall. It was identical to the boxes she had seen Sheriff Duncan loading into his car on the night that started all her troubles. Sarah's survival instincts, sharpened by months of running and hiding, told her that something was very wrong. She noticed that Jake seemed nervous and kept looking toward the dark corners of the warehouse. She also realized that the building was too convenient and too perfectly set up for their supposed mission. Real abandoned warehouses didn't have electricity and clean floors. Before Jake could stop her, Sarah pulled out the gun she had taken from the abandoned cabin. She pointed it at Jake and demanded to know what was really happening. The bounty hunter tried to lie, but Sarah could see the guilt written all over his face. She realized that he had betrayed her to Sheriff Duncan, and that they were probably surrounded by armed deputies waiting to kill her. Jake tried to explain that he had only made the deal with Sheriff Duncan to protect her from getting herself killed. He insisted that his plan was to turn her in safely, and then work with federal agents to bring down Duncan's operation through legal channels. But Sarah was beyond listening to explanations or excuses. She felt like a fool for trusting anyone after everything she had been through. The confrontation between Sarah and Jake was interrupted when Sheriff Duncan's voice echoed through the warehouse from hidden speakers. The sheriff congratulated Jake on bringing Sarah to him as promised, but then explained that both of them would be dying tonight. Duncan revealed his plan to frame them as criminal partners and stage their deaths as a heroic law enforcement operation. Jake realized that he had been played just as badly as Sarah had. Sheriff Duncan had never intended to honor their agreement or let either of them live. The bounty hunter had betrayed the only person who trusted him, and now they were both going to die because of his decision. He tried to apologize to Sarah, but she was already moving toward cover as the first gunshots rang out. Sheriff Duncan's deputies opened fire from multiple directions, trying to end the situation quickly. But they had underestimated what months of survival had taught Sarah about staying alive under impossible circumstances. She moved through the warehouse like someone who had nothing left to lose, using the planted evidence and warehouse equipment as cover while she tried to find a way out. Jake was hit in the shoulder during the first exchange of gunfire, but he managed to reach cover behind an overturned table. Despite everything that had happened, he found himself fighting alongside Sarah against Sheriff Duncan's men. The bounty hunter realized that this was probably his only chance to redeem himself for his betrayal, even if it cost him his life. The shootout in the warehouse marked the end of Sarah's time as a victim running from Sheriff Duncan's hunt. Win or lose, she was finally fighting back against the man who had destroyed her life and killed her mother, but she was also learning a painful lesson about trust and betrayal that would change how she dealt with people for the rest of her life. The gunfight in the warehouse lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours to Sarah. She had never been in a real shootout before, and the sound of bullets hitting metal and concrete around her was terrifying. But the months of running and hiding had taught her to think clearly under pressure, and she used every piece of cover in the building to stay alive while Sheriff Duncan's deputies tried to surround her. Jake was bleeding badly from his shoulder wound, but he continued fighting alongside Sarah despite his betrayal. The bounty hunter had military experience from years ago, and his tactical knowledge helped them survive the initial assault. He showed Sarah how to use the warehouse's layout to their advantage, moving between cover points and forcing the deputies to expose themselves when they tried to get better shooting positions. Sheriff Duncan himself stayed hidden behind his men, shouting orders and coordinating the attack through a radio. Sarah could hear his voice clearly, and the cold anger in his tone told her that he was enjoying this final hunt. The sheriff had been chasing her for months, and now he was finally close enough to finish the job personally. During a brief pause in the shooting, Sarah heard something that made her heart race. Sheriff Duncan was calling for backup from more deputies and asking for the warehouse to be surrounded completely. Sarah realized that even if she and Jake managed to survive this immediate attack, they would be trapped inside with no way to escape. The sheriff was planning to end this situation permanently, no matter how long it took. But Sarah also heard something else in Sheriff Duncan's radio communications that gave her an idea. The sheriff was being very careful about what he said over the radio, using code words and avoiding any mention of his real reasons for wanting Sarah dead. This suggested that he was worried about other law enforcement agencies monitoring his communications. Maybe Jake's contacts in federal law enforcement were closer than Sarah had realized. During another exchange of gunfire, Sarah managed to work her way closer to the table where the wooden boxes were stored. She recognized the markings she had first seen months ago when this nightmare began, but now she was close enough to read the labels and shipping information on the boxes. What she saw made her understand the full scope of Sheriff Duncan's criminal operation. The boxes contained high-grade cocaine and synthetic drugs that were being distributed throughout the state. But more importantly, the shipping labels showed that the drugs were coming from suppliers in Mexico and being distributed to buyers in major cities hundreds of miles away. This wasn't just a local corruption problem. It was part of a major drug trafficking network that crossed state and international borders. Sarah used her phone to take clear photos of the labels and contents of several boxes. She also found documents in a briefcase that showed financial records and communication between Sheriff Duncan and his suppliers and buyers. This was the kind of evidence that Jake had been talking about, proof that would interest federal law enforcement agencies and couldn't be ignored or covered up by local corruption. Jake saw what Sarah was doing and managed to provide covering fire while she gathered the evidence. Despite his betrayal, the bounty hunter seemed genuinely committed to helping her expose Sheriff Duncan's operation. Sarah wasn't ready to forgive Jake for lying to her, but she needed his help to survive long enough to get the evidence to the right people. The situation changed dramatically when they heard sirens approaching from outside the warehouse. Sheriff Duncan's backup had arrived, but so had someone else. Sarah could hear different radio frequencies and voices that didn't belong to the sheriff's department. Jake's federal law enforcement contacts had apparently been tracking their situation and had arrived to investigate the gunfire reports, Sheriff. Duncan realized that the situation was spiraling out of his control. His original plan to quietly eliminate Sarah and Jake had turned into a major incident that was attracting outside attention. The sheriff tried to establish radio contact with the federal agents outside, presenting himself as a local law enforcement officer dealing with dangerous fugitives. But the federal agents weren't fooled by Sheriff Duncan's story. They had been investigating reports of corruption in Pine Creek for weeks, partly based on information that Jake had provided during his earlier communications. The agents were prepared for the possibility that local law enforcement might be compromised, and they approached the situation with appropriate caution. From inside the warehouse, Sarah could hear negotiations happening between Sheriff Duncan and the federal agents. The sheriff was trying to maintain his story about Sarah being a dangerous criminal, but the agents were asking detailed questions about why a simple fugitive capture required so many armed deputies and why it was taking place in an abandoned warehouse in the middle of the night. Sarah made a desperate decision that would either save her life or end it immediately. She called out to the federal agents outside, identifying herself as the fugitive they were discussing, and offering to surrender directly to them rather than to Sheriff Duncan's men. She shouted that she had evidence of corruption and drug trafficking that needed to be seen by honest law enforcement officers. Sheriff Duncan tried to stop Sarah from communicating with the federal agents, ordering his deputies to resume shooting. But now the deputies were confused and scared. They could hear the federal agents outside demanding to know why local law enforcement was preventing a fugitive from surrendering peacefully. Some of the deputies began to suspect that they were involved in something that wasn't legitimate police work. The standoff continued for another hour while federal agents established a perimeter around the warehouse and demanded that Sheriff Duncan allow them to negotiate directly with the fugitive inside. Sarah used this time to continue gathering evidence from the boxes and documents in the warehouse. She also tended to Jake's wound as best she could with torn pieces of cloth. Jake was getting weaker from blood loss, but he remained conscious long enough to help Sarah understand what they had discovered. The bounty hunter explained that the evidence she had photographed would be enough to bring down not just Sheriff Duncan, but potentially dozens of other people involved in the drug trafficking network. This was much bigger than either of them had imagined when they first started working together. As dawn began to break outside the warehouse, Sarah could hear more vehicles arriving. The federal agents were bringing in additional resources and establishing a proper command post. Sheriff Duncan's attempts to control the narrative were failing as more outside observers arrived on the scene. Sarah realized that she was finally in a position where she might survive this ordeal and see justice done. But she also knew that Sheriff Duncan wouldn't give up easily. The sheriff had too much to lose and too many secrets to protect. He would probably try one final desperate move to eliminate her and the evidence she had gathered. Sarah was right to be worried. Sheriff Duncan had been using his radio to coordinate with Marcus Reeves and other criminal associates who weren't part of the official law enforcement response. The sheriff was planning to create enough chaos and violence to cover his escape and destroy the evidence that could link him to the drug trafficking operation. The real test of Sarah's survival skills was about to begin. Everything she had learned during months of running and hiding would be needed for the final confrontation with the man who had destroyed her life and killed her mother. The explosion that rocked the warehouse came without warning. Sheriff Duncan's criminal associates had arrived with enough firepower to turn the building into a war zone. Sarah was thrown to the ground by the blast, her ears ringing and dust filling her lungs. Through the smoke and debris, she could see that part of the warehouse wall had been blown open, creating a gaping hole that eliminated any chance of a peaceful surrender to the federal agents outside. Jake was unconscious from the explosion, bleeding more heavily now from his original wound and several new cuts from flying debris. Sarah tried to wake him up, but there wasn't time. She could hear Sheriff Duncan shouting orders to his men, and the sound of automatic weapons fire coming from multiple directions. The sheriff had decided that his only option was to eliminate everyone who could testify against him, including his own deputies if necessary. Marcus Reeves and his crew had brought military-grade weapons and explosives that they had probably obtained from the same sources as their drug supplies. These weren't local criminals anymore. They were part of an organized network that had resources and experience dealing with law enforcement. Sarah realized that the federal agents outside were probably outgunned and unprepared for this level of violence. Through the hole in the warehouse wall, Sarah could see Sheriff Duncan's patrol car speeding away from the scene. The coward was abandoning his own men and letting Marcus Reeves handle the cleanup operation. But Sarah also noticed that the sheriff was carrying a large briefcase that probably contained the most incriminating evidence from his office. Duncan was planning to destroy everything that could link him to the drug operation and then disappear permanently. Sarah made a split-second decision that surprised even her. Instead of trying to escape through the chaos and confusion, she grabbed the evidence she had photographed and the briefcase full of documents from the warehouse. Then she dragged the unconscious Jake toward the hole in the wall in the sheriff's abandoned patrol car. She was going after Sheriff Duncan personally, and she was taking proof of his crimes with her. The federal agents were pinned down by gunfire from Marcus Reeves's men, but Sarah managed to reach the patrol car without being seen. She had learned to move quietly and stay invisible during her months of running, and those skills served her well now. She got Jake into the passenger seat and started the engine, knowing that she probably had only minutes before someone noticed the car was gone. Sheriff Duncan had a significant head start, but Sarah knew the local roads better than he probably expected. She had grown up in Pine Creek and had spent countless hours driving these mountain roads during her teenage years. She also knew where Duncan would likely go. There was an old airstrip about 20 miles outside, town that was sometimes used by smugglers and other criminals who needed to leave the area quickly. The chase through the mountain roads was dangerous and desperate. Sheriff Duncan was driving like a man with nothing to lose, taking curves at dangerous speeds and running other cars off the road. Sarah stayed far enough behind to avoid being seen, but close enough to keep track of where he was going. Jake regained consciousness during the drive and tried to convince Sarah to turn around and go back to the federal agents. But Sarah was beyond listening to rational advice. She had been hunted like an animal for months, lost her mother, and been betrayed by the one person she had learned to trust. Sheriff Duncan represented everything that had gone wrong in her life, and she wasn't going to let him escape to start over somewhere else. She was going to end this chase once and for all, even if it killed her. The airstrip was exactly where Sarah expected it to be. She could see a small private plane waiting on the runway with its engine already running. Sheriff Duncan's car was parked near a hangar, and the sheriff himself was transferring boxes and briefcases from his car to the plane. He was planning to fly out of the country with enough evidence and money to disappear permanently. Sarah parked the patrol car behind the hangar where it couldn't be seen from the runway. She helped Jake out of the car, but the bounty hunter was too weak to be much help in a confrontation. Sarah gave him the phone with the photos she had taken and told him to call the federal agents as soon as she moved toward the runway. If something happened to her, at least the evidence would survive. The confrontation between Sarah and Sheriff Duncan took place on the empty runway in the early morning sunlight. The sheriff was surprised to see her alive and even more surprised that she had managed to track him down. He had underestimated her intelligence and determination from the very beginning, treating her like a helpless victim instead of the dangerous adversary she had become. Sheriff Duncan tried to negotiate with Sarah, offering her money and promising to leave her alone if she would just walk away and let him escape. He seemed genuinely puzzled by her refusal to accept his offers. Duncan was the kind of man who believed that everyone had a price and that every problem could be solved with enough money or threats. But Sarah was no longer motivated by money or personal safety. She wanted justice for her mother's death and for all the other people Sheriff Duncan had hurt during his criminal career. She wanted him to face trial and punishment instead of escaping to enjoy his stolen wealth in some foreign country. Most of all, she wanted to prove to herself that she was more than just a victim of circumstances. The standoff on the runway lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like the climax of everything Sarah had been through. Sheriff Duncan was armed and desperate, while Sarah had only the gun she had taken from the abandoned cabin and the evidence that could destroy his life. Neither of them was willing to back down, and both of them knew that only one person would walk away from this confrontation. Sheriff Duncan made the mistake of underestimating Sarah one final time. He assumed that a former diner waitress wouldn't have the nerve to actually shoot someone, even in self-defense. The sheriff drew his weapon confidently, expecting Sarah to surrender when faced with certain death. But the woman standing on that runway was no longer the scared waitress who had witnessed a crime and panicked. Sarah had been transformed by months of survival, loss, and betrayal into someone who understood that some fights can only end one way. When Sheriff Duncan pointed his gun at her, Sarah didn't hesitate to defend herself. The gunshot echoed across the empty airstrip, followed by silence that seemed to last forever. Sarah stood alone on the runway, holding the smoking gun and watching Sheriff Duncan's body lying motionless near the plane that would never take him to safety. She felt no satisfaction or relief, only a hollow emptiness where her anger had been. Jake managed to reach the runway in time to see the aftermath of the confrontation. The federal agents arrived a few minutes later, having followed the trail of destruction from the warehouse to the airstrip. Sarah surrendered her weapon without resistance and handed over all the evidence she had gathered against Sheriff Duncan's criminal network. The bounty hunter's betrayal had led to Sheriff Duncan's death, but it had also resulted in the exposure of a major drug trafficking operation that involved dozens of criminals across several states. Sarah had finally gotten justice for her mother's death, but the price had been higher than she ever imagined when she first decided to stop running and fight back.